al-Nahda surpassed 1,000 people. There were many Rabaa massacres throughout the country. The point of the massacre was not only the dispersal, but the creation of the spectacle of violence. Rabaa ushered an unprecedented era of state violence against politics, public spaces, and political dissent. Security officials are no longer shooting at victims and civilians in broad daylight in the middle of Cairo anymore. But the Rabaa effect continues to animate public and private life in Egypt. There are nearly 60,000 political prisoners right now. There are estimates that indicate that since August 2013, at least one prisoner has died behind bars every 4 days due to medical negligence and torture in prisons. Travel bans and asset freezes continue to be used to silence activists and civil society on the ground. To discuss this and more, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. We are joined by Congressman Tom Malinowski. Congressman Malinowski is an American politician and diplomat who represented New Jersey's 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2019 to 2013. As former co-chair of the Egypt Human Rights Caucus in Congress, he's a vocal advocate for human rights in Egypt. He has also served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor during the Obama administration. Please join me in also welcoming Hassan al-Banna Tahir, who's an Egyptian journalist and researcher and human rights defender, who's also a political prisoner. Now based in Turkey, he's the executive director of an organization called People at Risk, a human rights organization that provides support for activists in exile. We are also joined by Fajr Abdel Nasser, sociologist and researcher whose work has informed my own dissertation work on Rabaa and the aftermath of violence in Egypt, and who was also present at the massacre 10 years ago. And last but not least, we are joined by FI's own Andrea Prasso. Andrea is the executive director of the Freedom Initiative, an organization that advocates for the freedom of political prisoners in the Middle East and North Africa, with focuses on Egypt and Saudi Arabia. My first question today is for Congressman Malinowski. We're about to hear directly from people who were present in Rabaa at the day of the massacre. While the massacre happened in Cairo, in many ways, it was an event that garnered much international attention from actors around the world, as well as here at home in the US. By the time you arrived as the top human rights official a year later, did you feel that the US was supporting Egypt as well as they could?
Well, it depends on what you mean by supporting Egypt, I suppose. I've never been a huge fan of my country's policy towards Egypt, and not simply because I care about human rights. I don't think the United States gets much out of its relationship with the Egyptian military. We can talk a little bit more about that later. I would say when I arrived at the State Department in 2014, when I was confirmed to be the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, the United States government was, as usual, trying to have it a bit both ways. I think everybody here knows that when the military coup happened, as part of those terrible events, the U.S. government, the State Department, did not call it a coup, in part because they didn't want to trigger the requirements of the law that would have required ending military assistance until democracy was restored. And yet they did temporarily end military assistance. In other words, they did the things that the coup law required, but didn't want to say the word coup. And that hesitation, I think, was read correctly in Cairo within the military as a sign that the United States would protest what had happened, that they would advocate for human rights, that they would say things that were irritating to the Egyptian military, but eventually they would come around. And that's what happened. The money was withheld, and over the next 2 or 3 years, there was a process in which the US government gradually restored its relationship with the Egyptian military in the fullest possible sense, trying to get some relatively minor concessions along the way, one of which was the release of Mohammed Sultan from prison, which was the final step that unlocked the restoration of the military assistance. So were we trying to do something good? Yeah, but not very effectively and in ways that I think the Egyptian military read as not displaying a lot of American confidence in our power to change things.
Thank you for that answer. And throughout the discussion today, I'm sure we'll pull on a lot of the threads in that a lot. Appreciate you, Congressman. Fudge, a lot of us saw the massacre on TV. We heard about it. We saw friends and family members either being detained. We saw what they wrote on Facebook and Twitter. But the vast majority of us were not there on the ground. As someone who was there, to the extent you're comfortable, can you share how it felt to be on the ground, how old you were and what you saw?
Sure. I was 16 years old, a teenager in my senior year in high school. I attended most of the protests since the Egyptian Revolution 2011, but in my whole life, I have never seen something like this. It was more like a war zone. It's something that shakes my body while I'm talking about. 12 hours exactly of tear gas, bullets, snipers. Kids are crying, bodies that are burning alive. It's something that I really can't describe. My body remembers the trauma, my mind remembers the trauma, my heart remembers the trauma, something that I can't escape from even after 10 years later. Yeah, it was mainly like a war zone for me. It's something that I can't heal from. It's an experience that you can't heal from.
Hassan, as a journalist and a human rights defender who was in Egypt at the time, even if you weren't at Rabaa, can you tell us a little bit about what the country was like? Rabaa, was it an isolated incident, or was the entirety of Cairo turned into the war zone that Fudge was talking about? How did it feel to be in Egypt but not at that exact square at the time?
يعني كانت الثورة بتجاهد لأنها ترسى عقد اجتماعي جديد مفاده إنه لما حد زي خالد سعيد يتعرض للتعذيب أو يتعرض للقتل على أيدي القوات الأمن، إن ده كفيل إن هو يحرك الشعب المصري كله وينزل في ثورة يفقد فيها 800 شهيد عشان خاطر بس يدافع عن قيمة حياة إنسان وحيد. اللي حصل في رابعة إنه تم إنشاء عقد اجتماعي جديد بقوة السلاح، بقوة سلاح الجيش، بقوة سلاح الشرطة، مفاده إنه حياة المصريين بلا ثمن. يمكن أن يقتل 1000 مصري في عدد ساعات محدود للغاية ثم لا يحدث شيء لا في مصر ولا في العالم من حولها. ده كان رسالة شديدة الإحباط وشديدة السوء، وحولت المصريين من جماعة بشرية لها وجدان مشترك، لها حلم مشترك، لها ضمير مشترك، إلى إنه جماعة معتدية وجماعة معتدى عليها. يعني برعاية من النظام أطلق العنان لكل الشرور في النفس البشرية في يوم رابعة لمزيد من الاقتتال، توسيع دائرة العنف خارج دائرة الاعتصام، للمجازر التي تلت رابعة مباشرة، للاشتباك من بيت لبيت وحارة لحارة. يعني فهذا كان شيء شديد الإحباط.
Shukran, Hassan. Thank you, Hassan. For our listeners and participants who are listening in English or Arabic, there's an interpretation icon that you can click on to switch between languages depending on the language the speaker is using. Andrea, my question is to you now. It's been a decade since the massacre, the event that brings us all together today. Have threats towards citizens, towards Egyptians, both in Egypt and abroad, have they stopped? Have they grown? Have they gotten worse? Can you paint a picture for what it looks like today?
Yeah, thanks, Amr. It's funny because at the Freedom Initiative, which was founded by Mohammed Sultan, we always talk about how much should we talk about Mohammed Sultan. Of course, we tell the story of our founder, why we exist, but it's not. We do the work that we do every day. And of course, Representative Malinowski has highlighted actually that Mohammed Sultan being free to found the Freedom Initiative is sort of this pivotal point about US engagement with Egypt. So when Sultan was freed through the significant efforts of people in the US government and founded the Freedom Initiative, he did so because he knew that there were so many people still in prison. And I think knew not only that were so many people there, but that the system itself was not going to change, that there needed to be some kind of robust engagement, both in terms of helping individual prisoners. As you've said, we have no accurate estimates because of course we don't get real data, but up to 60,000 wrongfully detained in Egyptian prisons, and that someone has to hold the US government to account for its participation and support of a system that continues to oppress, continues to have wrongful detention. And more recently, what we've seen, an additional troubling component is what we call transnational repression. So the Egyptian government's denial of human rights to its population is itself a serious problem, of course, for Egyptians and for the global community. And then you add on to it the fact that they're not satisfied with just engaging in human rights violations at home. It's also about really ruling their populace with an iron fist, so that people who live in the United States or Canada or the UK or anywhere around the world, if they're Egyptian or if they have Egyptian family members, whether they are the actual human rights defenders that the Egyptian government doesn't like, or just a family member of someone, they are at risk as well. They are at risk of surveillance. They are at risk of violence. They are at risk of denial of their freedom and their liberty that is supposed to be guaranteed to them in the democracies that many of them live in. So I think that when we think about where we are now, in many ways we haven't seen, not only have we not seen progress, we've seen a regression. We've seen a sort of emboldening of the Egyptian regime's view that it can act with impunity. And in addition to the transnational repression component, what we see in the region in general is that authoritarians help each other. They support each other's efforts to deny their people their fundamental rights and freedoms. We see people being deported from other countries in the region back to Egypt to be in unjust detention. We've seen the use of the Arab Interior Ministers Council, for example, similar to Interpol, to send people back to Egypt. People being detained at the request of the Egyptian authorities or at the request of the AIMC itself. And we also see authoritarians learn from each other by watching, by actually seeing the engagement, the different tools that they use to suppress their populations. And so I think we're in a really troubling place right now, not just with respect to Egypt, but with respect to where Egypt sits in the region. And the US really robust continued support does not go unnoticed. I was fortunate enough to go to Egypt in November for the UN climate conference for COP27. And I was there when the US delegation was there, when the president was there, and when Speaker Pelosi was there. And I was speaking to Egyptian human rights activists who said, we look at these pictures and we see the president and the speaker embrace Sisi, and our brothers and sisters are in prison down the road, not able to be here at this conference because anyone who protests, anyone who stands up in support of environmental rights or any other human right ends up in detention. And though I believe that the US government did raise not only specific prisoner cases, but human rights issues in general, the message to the people of Egypt was that I've said this before, but the United States stands with the regime, not with the people. And, that's putting the US on the wrong side of history, and certainly on the wrong side of where this administration has claimed that it would be in terms of its pledges, from Biden on the campaign trail throughout this administration to put human rights, support of human rights, promotion of human rights at the forefront of US foreign policy. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, Andrea. And on the work that needs to be done, Congressman Malinowski, as one of the original co-chairs of the Egypt Human Rights Caucus, and as a lifelong human rights advocate and a leading voice on Egypt's human rights situation, a lot of us feel very pessimistic, but you weren't on throughout your career, either at state or in Congress, one of the leading voices and one of the advocates for change and for a better human rights situation in Egypt. What role do you think advocacy has in moving the needle? Does it really matter? Does it really matter that people go and like knock on doors in Congress? Is there any hope for moving the needle of US policy towards it?
Yeah, there's absolutely there is, and it has made a difference. In my first stint in government, working for the Clinton administration, there was a sense that there was a Middle East exception to American human rights and democracy policy around the world, in the sense that it was just never even raised. The idea of withholding aid would have been considered crazy, and even raising human rights issues with then President Mubarak just would never have happened. And President Clinton cared about human rights. He talked about it all over the world. We went to war over human rights in the Balkans twice, but there was a black hole when it came to the Middle East, and that changed. And I don't like our policy, but we do actually have human rights as part of our policy towards Europe, and towards Egypt. And that is the result of advocacy. That is the result of constant pressure. That is the result of good journalism that makes it impossible for policymakers to ignore what goes on in Egyptian prisons. We're not where we need to be, but the people who are doing this work are the reason why Congress every single year passes legislation that, gives money to Egypt, but with strings attached. It's the reason why administrations have, at least from time to time, implemented or partially implemented that legislation. And while we don't get most of what we want, every single prisoner who's released or allowed to travel, that is a breakthrough for that person, for that family, and it makes all the work worthwhile.
Thank you, Congressman. Back to you, Hassan. As a former political prisoner and an advocate now, you were with many of the defendants while you were in prison, of the defendants in the Rabaa case, in the Rabaa dispersal case. How do they relate to the massacre? Is it still on their minds? Is it still part of what they think of? And as an advocate now, what are we missing in terms of advocacy? What can we do better?
أنا عشت في السجن سنة كاملة بصحبة المحبوسين على ذمة قضية رابعة العدوية. الناس اللي بتعاقب لتهمة وحيدة، وهي أنهم لم يموتوا في رابعة. دي التهمة الأساسية الوحيدة اللي بيحاكم عليها المحبوسين على ذمة قضية رابعة. أكثر من 1000 أو حوالي 1000 إنسان سجن على الأقل 5 سنين، وتتراوح الأحكام من 5 سنين إلى الإعدام. لا زالوا منهم حوالي 200-300 شخص جوه السجن، لا زالوا بيدفعوا ضريبة كونهم ضحايا اعتصام رابعة. التهم كانت عبثية للغاية، والمحبوسين كانوا يعني بشكل عشوائي للغاية. دور المناصرة هي تركيز الضوء على قيمة حياة هؤلاء الناس، وجود أسر ليهم، اسمع صوتهم. احنا بنتكلم عن حوالي 70 واحد محكوم بالإعدام. قد نستيقظ في أي يوم من الأيام لنجد أن هذه الأحكام قد أيدت وقد نفذت فيهم. المذبحة لا زالت مستمرة. هذه هي الرسالة التي يجب إيصالها في المناصرة دائما. الأمر ليس تاريخا وليس حدثا قد انتهى، ولكنه مستمر إلى الآن. عشرات الأسر وأنا هنا أتحدث عن ربعة فقط، وليس عن القمع الممتد المتجاوز الذي انفجر بعد ربعة. أنا أتكلم عن المحبوسين على ذمة قضايا ربعة، العشرات منهم ابن أخي محكوم حكم 15 سنة. هذه الأسر إلى الآن تعاني أثر المذبحة، لا زالوا مهددين بالموت، لا زالوا مهددين بالسجن، مهددين بالفقر، مهددين بكل الشرور اللي في الدنيا. دور المناصرة هي إنه تسمع صوت هؤلاء. شكرا لكل الناس اللي بالفعل بتساهم في إيصال هذه الأصوات، ولكن نحتاج دائما إلى المزيد. تحتاج حتى تتوقف هذه الحالة المجنونة، نحتاج دائما إلى المزيد من الجهود، إلى المزيد من الضغط، إلى المزيد من التشبيك والمناصرة.
شكرا يا حسن. Thank you, Hassan, for your powerful remarks. But I'm going to go to you. Hassan, in his remarks, said that a lot of people are paying the price of not being dead and that the massacre is still ongoing. 10 years later, how does Rabaa still affect you and how does it affect your family?
As Hassan said, like, we're paying the price that we are not dead yet, because you actually don't exist anymore. As an Egyptian person, you don't have the legal rights anymore to travel back to your country or renew your passport or renew your ID or even travel from the place you are living right now in, unless if you are lucky enough to obtain a new passport or accepted as a refugee. But again, you are not considered as a refugee because dominant countries doesn't perceive you as a refugee because they don't take what happens in Egypt as a military coup. They deal with it as if something minor happened and then life goes on. The Sisi is still the president. So you don't exist anymore. You are an outsider. You have totally vanished this day. As Hassan said, it's ongoing pain, it's ongoing struggle, it's ongoing trauma. You can't escape, even if you actually physically escaped. It still haunts you in every aspect of your life. It shaped your life. My family, my mom and my sister, because my dad was killed there, they have been struggling because they don't have the papers right now, their passport, they can't renew it, so they are stuck where they live in. It's a disaster. You no longer belong to the system. They don't see you as a human being or as an Egyptian citizen anymore.
Thank you, Fadl. And just a reminder to all of the participants in the room, we have some questions that are coming in already. We have one more round of questions after I go to entry, and then we will get questions from participants and from listeners. So please, if you have questions in the next 5 to 10 minutes, make sure to submit them and we'll try to get to as many of them as time permits. Andrea, we heard from Congressman Malinowski about the importance of advocacy, and we heard from both Hassan and Fadl about the human cost, the ongoing human cost of this. What role does FI play in honoring the legacy and the trauma of Rabaa and its aftermath and advocating on behalf of those who continue to be affected by it?
Well, I think that, as I said, we exist in part because of Rabaa, of course. And what I've learned, certainly I'm not Egyptian, I'm not an expert in Egypt, but the more that we speak to people, what you're hearing today is what you hear from every Egyptian, that people walk around carrying the scars of Rabaa in them, whether they're still in Egypt or they're outside of Egypt. And there are the people who are actually in prison, who have been in prison since then. There are the people who are in prison because of the regime that continues, that persists because of that. So what we do is we try to take those stories to people who can make a difference. I mean, our model, we are here in Washington, and we work with people like Representative Malinowski and others to try to change US policy so that it puts pressure on the Egyptian government, on other governments around it as well, to move towards a more human rights respecting approach. Now, I mean, it sounds almost ludicrous to say, you know, we try to get CC to respect human rights. But part of what we do, part of why we work on individual political prisoner cases is, one, because each person matters, of course, but, you know, we're a small team and there are maybe 60,000 wrongfully detained in Egypt alone. So we recognize we can't work on every case. But every release, every person released from prison, from travel ban, it chips away at this notion that the Egyptian regime has, which is that they can control everyone at all times if they wish. And each release reminds the people who are seeking justice that there is some prospect of it. But as I said, most importantly, it chips away at this notion the regime has that they can get away with anything. And I think that's really essential. It also provides, you know, our individual work telling the stories of the wrongfully detained also helps people connect with an issue that otherwise just seems too overwhelming to process. The human brain can't understand 60,000 people in detention. I mean, I can't even imagine the physical sites involved in detaining that many people. So you tell the story of one person, two people, three people, and that lets people engage in a different way. And it gives them an entree into dealing with the broader issues. So I think that's where our work is most meaningful. We're working directly with people related to supporting, advocating for the wrongfully detained and telling their stories outside of Egypt so that people understand what's happening. And then once they understand it, they can try to make a difference.
Congressman Malinowski, my last question to you before we get to the room is that none of the perpetrators of the massacre so far have been held accountable. As a matter of fact, if you look at the trajectory, some of the people involved were rewarded for their involvement in the massacre. Is that always going to be the case? Does that have to be the case? Are there pathways for sanctions or for international accountability that can be pursued against some of the perpetrators of these gross human rights violations?
The United States has tools, and there are tools in the international community. The United States has the Magnitsky Act, for example, which has been used in other cases in the Middle East where you might have thought the politics would have precluded it. We have used the Magnitsky Act to sanction Saudi government officials and security officers for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, for example. Using that law requires evidence and political will. And the evidence part is where the advocacy community comes in. You can make it harder for the State Department not to impose a sanction by providing very detailed and solid evidence of individual responsibility for a terrible crime. And sometimes that's not easy. We may all know, of course, it's obvious that, you know, these are the people who run Egypt, and so obviously they're responsible, but you still have to demonstrate it. And the more solidly, thoroughly you can demonstrate something like that, the harder it becomes for the officials at the State Department and the Treasury Department who manage this program to not use the tool. They can still choose to not use the tool, and that's where political will comes in. But the part that you can control is the evidence. There are now Magnitsky acts or similar laws passed all over the world, Canada and Europe, and I would strongly encourage a similar approach in those countries. And then finally, you know, I do think there is potential of using international treaties like the Torture Convention. If we could get a country, for example, to file a case against Egypt under the Torture Convention, that would be a breakthrough and something that I think would be extremely troubling to the Egyptian government, because it does want to be seen as a legitimate government, a member of the UN in good standing, and could not ignore such an effort. And there have been some interesting uses of human rights treaties in just the last few years. The Gambia filing a suit against Myanmar, Burma, for example, for committing genocide against the Rohingya. There may be other similar cases brewing with respect to other countries. So those are some of the tools, and that's why you guys exist, to use them.
And it's something that we have been working on and continue to work on at the Freedom Initiative. But back to you, 10 years on, how can we continue to honor the memories of those who lost their lives at the massacre and its aftermath?
We can send flowers to their graves, but justice smells more nice, I think. We need justice. There's no a comprehend in this. There is no a middle solution in this. There is only one thing that we can do, is to try to achieve a partial justice, at least to admit that this is the most and the biggest massacre in Egypt modern history. Actually, if you ask ChatGPT what is the biggest massacre in modern history in Egypt, they will give you information that it's Rabaa massacre. You know, AI doesn't lie, but Sisi does. He can't admit. He doesn't want to admit. Dominant countries doesn't want to admit that this is a military coup, and we are living a nightmare. So the only thing that we can do for them is to bring justice. And of course, to work on the ongoing trauma that people are living inside in jail, and their families that, I don't know, their families are suffering. And it's still haunting us. Even if we escaped from this, it's still haunting us in every aspect of life. So I think the only thing to do is to bring justice.
Thank you so much. But Hassan, to you now. And just a reminder to participants, we have some questions coming in. We'll get to them. But please feel free to send questions to the panelists. Feel free to ask the entirety of the panel, or to direct your question to one of the panelists in particular. Hassan, how has as a former political prisoner, you saw the state apparatus, you saw the faces of the state apparatus, you saw officers, you saw Umanat, you saw support, you saw high-ranking and low-ranking officers. How has, over the last 10 years, how has the Egyptian government's response to the Rabaa massacre impacted the pursuit of transitional justice in the country?
كان رد محبط للغاية. يعني لم نشاهد أي موقف صلب من المجتمع الدولي يمنع تكرار مجزرة مثل رابعة في مصر الآن. حتى الآن يمتلك هذا النظام القدرة على تكرار رابعة، بل وأضعاف رابعة. إلى الآن لم يستطع المجتمع المدني إرسال رسالة إلى نظام عبد الفتاح السيسي أن دماء المصريين خطا أحمرا، بل على العكس. كما فشل المجتمع الدولي في إرسال هذه الرسالة إلى أنظمة مثل النظام السوري، فقد نجح النظام المصري أيضا ألا يستقبل هذه الرسالة، وهو مستمر في التنكيل بالمصريين بأشكال مختلفة، كامتداد لمذبحة رابعة من الاختفاء القسري والقتل خارج إطار القانون والحرمان من وثائق السفر والمنع من السفر ومطاردة المصريين في الخارج إلى آخره من هذه الانتهاكات. وإلى الآن لا يشعر النظام أنه في خطر حقيقي حينما يمارس مثل هذه الانتهاكات. لا عقوبات دولية، لا منع المعونة، لا عزلة دولية، بل بالعكس أوروبا منهمكة في التعاون مع النظام المصري للسيطرة على ملف اللاجئين، والأمريكان منهمكين في التطبيع مع النظام المصري لاعتباراتهم الخاصة، بالإضافة إلى أن النظام محمي بالمنظومة العربية الفاسدة إجمالا. فحتى الآن الرسالة أنه يمكنك قتل المصريين كما تشاء وستفلت من العقوبة.
شكرا يا حسن. Now we're going to move now to some of the questions that we got from participants online. I'm going to direct the question to one of the panelists, and if any of the other of the panelists want to chime in, please let me know, or please just chime in directly afterwards. The question to Hassan actually is, does the recent presidential pardon of Patrick Zeki show a possible shift in the actions of the Egyptian government regarding respect for human rights? هل الإفراج عن باتريك مؤشر إن الدولة المصرية بقت تحترم حقوق الإنسان؟
بالتأكيد يمكن للحكومات أن تتدخل، لأن هذا النظام هو نظام يعني بنقول باللغة المصرية أنه عالة. يعني هذا النظام محكوم باحتياجه الدائم للغرب في التسليح، واحتياجه الدائم للخليج في التمويل، واحتياجه الدائم لكل من يحول. هذا النظام فاشل تماما، وهو أضعف مما يبدو عليه. هو قوي فقط في القتل والقمع وقمع المصريين. لذلك لو توفرت الإرادة الدولية حقيقة لإحداث تغيير في مصر فسيتم التغيير. هذا النظام أضعف كثيرا من أنه يواجه مانحيه. هو معتمد عليهم كلية ويستمد منهم مبررات بقائه. كل ما ينقصنا فقط هو أن تتوفر إرادة في المجتمع الدولي لاعتبار ما يحدث في مصر انتهاك من يستدعي مواجهته.
Thank you, Hassan. Would any of the panelists like to chime in on whether the release of Patrick Zeki shows a possible shift in the actions of the Egyptian government regarding respect for human rights? Should we think of this as an opening of a new trend towards the Egyptians, or is it part of the piecemeal politics that has been ongoing over the last decade?
I'm happy to comment briefly, which is just to say that I don't think it represents a shift, but I do think it is an example of how advocacy matters. And that, as I'd said before, our model is that that's one case, of course, but here we are talking about it. Here we are saying, does this mean there's more hope, there's more possibility? And that's the model, that from the outside, at least, if we can chip away at these cases slowly, it makes a difference. And then when you have these individual cases that the international community will rally behind, it does open up those conversations about what can the US do, what can France do, what can the UK do, how can their relations with the Egyptian government support people who are in detention, who are having their rights denied to them. And each one of these cases lets us continue that conversation in a more robust way.
Thank you, Andrea. Congressman Malnowski, a couple of questions came in for you directly. The first of which is, you mentioned that the US does not benefit from its relationship with Egypt. Why does Washington have such a hard time changing the relationship, even after Rabaa and such a brutal decade of repression?
It's a very good question. This relationship has become kind of a habit that can't be broken. And I have a hard time fully understanding it. And let me say, I do understand analytically why the United States would sometimes trade off human rights for the pursuit of other national interests. I don't love it when that happens, but I understand it. But in this case, I just don't see the argument for the national interest. What is often cited is Egypt's relationship with Israel, the helpful role that it has sometimes played in resolving outbreaks of violence in Gaza, and that's true. But I think we all know that Israel does that in its own self-interest, and because it has become dependent on its security relationship with Israel, it doesn't do that as a favor to the United States. Going back to 2014, 2015, the United States launched a coalition to fight ISIS, and all of its partners in the Middle East, in the Gulf, Jordan, joined that coalition and did at least something to help. The only country that did absolutely nothing, that didn't fly a single mission in support of the anti-ISIS coalition, was the country that gets $1.3 billion in aid every year from the United States, and that's Egypt. It seemed to me when I was at the State Department that Egypt has come to treat the aid as an entitlement. The attitude of Egyptian government officials was that we should thank them for the favor of taking our money. And so I've always wanted to break that sense of entitlement. The idea that Egypt is somehow doing us a favor by being our partner, when in fact it is the Egyptian government that benefits from this assistance and from the security that the United States has provided. And if the relationship is to continue, and I hope it would in an ideal world, the Egyptian government needs to be much more respectful of American concerns about human rights and other issues, that they should not be trying to overthrow the government in Libya that the United States supported. They should not be trying to undermine the democracy in Sudan that the United States is supporting. Egypt should contribute something to the security of the region with all of the money and tanks and planes that we give them. If we're going to give Egypt access to weapons more sophisticated than we give to Ukraine, I would like to get something from it. And yet that argument has not broken through entirely among my former colleagues.
Thank you, Congressman Malinowski. This question is to you, and then to the rest of the panel, whoever wants to chime in. How can we support our friends and their families on this day, especially people who have bared the brunt of this violence or have lost family members?
خليني أتكلم بالعربي في النقطة دي بالأخص. أنا أعتقد إنه صعب جدا حد مقيم في مصر حاليا يكتب حتى تويتة يتريق فيها على السيسي، مش يكتب حتى مثلا الحرية للمعتقلين ولا المجد للشهداء ولا أي حاجة من هذا القبيل. صعب جدا جدا، لأنه زي ما حسن قال قبل كده إن الموضوع مش بس واقف عند مجزرة رابعة والمعتقلين اللي كل يوم بيعتقلوا، لا أنت مهدد طول الوقت، انت مراقب، انت في اي لحظه ممكن يفتح عليك الباب تختفي قسريا، محدش يعرف عنك اي حاجه ولا انت ولا اهلك. فمفيش اي حاجه، مفيش حتى نوع من انواع التكريم او مفيش نوع من انواع المطالبه بالحقوق وارده في مصر، في اي حد عايش في مصر او مقيم حتى في الدول العربيه المسانده للانقلاب. فانت في خطر. هي دي المشكلة، الاعتراف برابعة إنها مجزرة، والاعتراف بالانقلاب العسكري، والاعتراف بإن في أزمة حقيقية بتحصل في انتهاك لحقوق الإنسان، ده مش موجود من الدول الكبرى المسيطرة على سياسات العالم، ولا موجود حتى من الدول العربية المفروض تقف ضد قتل عربي زيها. فللأسف مفيش حاجة تتعمل قوي غير إنه الناس تفضل تطالب بشكل فيه يعني ما يأذيش حريتها أو ما يعرضهاش لخطر، ولكن دي معضلة صعب جدا تحقيقها يعني.
شكرا يا فجر. Thank you, Fajr. Next question is from one of the attendees to Andrea. Based on your experience as a veteran lawyer, do you believe that the human rights community possesses the evidence, tools, and know-how to pursue the perpetrators of the Rabaa massacre and other human rights violations in Egypt? If not, what additional resources or information would they need to intensify efforts to bring these perpetrators to trial?
Absolutely. The human rights community has the information, the resources, the know-how to pursue accountability. But you have to remember that justice is not blind. Justice is inherently political, particularly international justice mechanisms. And without the political support to pursue any method of accountability, it's very difficult. If you take the global Magnitsky sanctions we were talking about earlier, under US law, it's permissive, not mandatory, which means the government can choose to impose them. It should, of course, in most cases of human rights violations, but as we've seen, there haven't been any imposed on Egyptians, and it's not because of lack of evidence. Not only does the human rights community have the evidence, the US government has evidence as well. sufficient evidence to sanction any number of people, and they've chosen not to. As Representative Malinowski was saying, it's incumbent upon those of us in the advocacy community to make it very hard for them not to demand that they do so, to shift the political environment to make it more supportive of some methods of accountability. Sanctions are great, but they have a pretty minimal impact. They're designed to shift the behavior of the government. They don't serve, I don't think they have the emotional impact that actual criminal accountability does, though of course something is better than nothing. It's not easy to pursue accountability. All of us know we're not talking about people being pursued for human rights violations in Egypt. We don't expect any kind of prosecution of torturers, of judges, of lawyers, of people supporting the entire system of unjust detention and mistreatment. So that means looking outside of Egypt, and then it becomes exponentially harder. And then there are multiple constituencies that need to politically support it. But it's an important endeavor that I think needs to be pursued. And over time, part of what human rights activists do is document for the future. Document now, knowing that there may not be an accountability mechanism that is being pursued today, but maybe sometime in the future. The starkest case for many is, Syria as an example. Years of documentation of just horrific violations. And then finally, some gradual movement towards accountability against a handful of people, not against Assad and not against the entire regime, of course. But it's something, and it takes time. It may take generations for a true accounting. But I don't think the question is sort of tools and resources, though, of course, if anyone wants to give us more resources, we're always happy to take them. It's how do we shift the political environment to enable that kind of pursuit of justice.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Hassan, the next question is to you before I go back to Congressman Malinowski. This is merging a couple of questions that together. As a person living in exile, what can I do to fulfill my personal responsibility of standing against the human rights abuses committed by the Egyptian regime without putting myself or my family back home at risk? And also, there's this discourse of relying on foreign countries or الاستقلاء بالخارج. How do you as an activist and advocate deal with that tension?
خليني أجاوب من الشق الثاني للسؤال. أفضل دايما أن أنا أبدأ بحاجة زي كده. من يستقوي بالخارج هو النظام. يعني من يقتل المصريين بدعم الخارج وبسلاح الخارج وبالغطاء السياسي الخارجي سواء الخليجي أو الغربي هو النظام. نحن لا نستقوي بالخارج، نحن أصلا ضحايا. يعني نفتقد كل يعني أدوات القوة. يعني لو كان الخارج في صفنا ما حدث ذلك أصلا على الإطلاق. لو أن الغرب، هذه الصورة الوهمية في دماغ البعض أن أمريكا في صفنا، أن الغرب في صفنا، أن الخارج في صفنا، لو كان الخارج في صفنا لما قتلنا بهذا الشكل. ده أولا. السؤال الثاني، يكفي الالتزام الشخصي والضميري تجاه الضحايا وذويهم. يكفيك فقط أن تدين ولو بقلبك، ولو بقلبك فقط هذا العدوان على الأبرياء وعلى الغلابة. يعني عدا ذلك قدر استطاعتك افعل ما تشاء قدر استطاعتك. إذا كنت تستطيع أن تتبرع فلتتبرع، إذا كنت تستطيع أن تكتب فلتكتب، إذا كنت تستطيع أن تناصر فلتناصر. ولكن الحد الأدنى والإنساني، الحد الأدنى الإنساني هو أن تدين هذا بقلبك.
Thank you, Hassan. Congressman Malinowski, I'm merging a couple of questions or a few questions that you got from some of the online attendees. And I just wanted to note that some of the online attendees have their hands raised. It's going to be very difficult to get verbal participation from folks, so please feel free to type in your question if you'd like it to be addressed. Congressman Malinowski, the questions read as such. An advisor to the Republicans in the Senate once told me that Egypt is no longer a priority for the US. This seems evident when we compare Washington's reaction to the events in Egypt, including Rabaa, with the US response to the gruesome killing of Khashoggi. Do you believe that US policymakers, including Democrats, base their stance on human rights issues on factors other than principles? And then second part of this question is, as a leading voice for human rights, how do you deal with the cynicism and pessimism that a lot of these things that we fight for are either very far in between when we find successes or quite far-fetched that they might actually work out or bear fruit?
When I was running the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department, I used to, and I was giving pep talks to my staff. I would sometimes start by saying that you work for the part of the State Department that loses the most battles of any other part of this building. And then I would pause for a moment and watch them say, wait, what's this guy saying? That's pretty depressing. And then I would say, well, but you also work for the part of the State Department that wins the most battles of any other part of the State Department. How could both of those things be true? Well, because you pick the most fights, you pick the most battles. You're trying to change things. If you work on foreign policy in the United States and your job is managing relationships with our partners, with our allies in the world, that's a relatively easy job. You're trying to defend the status quo. If you work on human rights and democracy, you're trying to change things. And the people who stand in your way, your opponents, are sociopathic mass murderers who are willing to kill and to torture to get their way. This is very hard to beat people like that. And yet, from time to time, we do it. If we're successful 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10 times, that's actually a very, very good record. And it's worth dedicating your life to the cause of beating people like that, even if you're only successful some of the time. In the US Congress, we've lost some voices. Senator Pat Leahy was a very important champion of democracy and human rights around the world. He chaired the Appropriations Committee, so he was in charge of the money, of the aid. But the legislation that he wrote that conditioned the aid to Egypt, that resulted in withholding $130 million of aid in 2022, the Senate just adopted exactly the same language, even without Senator Leahy there, and despite some of the cynicism that you hear from other members. And so we lose some allies, but we gain allies. There are always people in Congress who are willing to fight for these good causes. And your job as advocates is to find those people, to cultivate more people, and to recognize you're never going to win 100%, but the world would be much worse if you were not doing this work.
Andrew, I want to ask you, you started your career and you spent a couple of decades working on cases that were either as hard or even harder than Egypt, defending detainees in Gitmo or in Guantanamo Bay. How different is this from that? What are the similarities and what are some of the continuities that you see? And again, how, as discussions of closing down Gitmo arise, do you think that how much more time do we have until human rights is on the agenda of US policy towards Egypt?
Well, great questions. I tell people that I have a career in banging my head against the wall because I have definitely chosen some of the less than satisfying areas to work in. But I like a good challenge. You can't, I don't think it's easy to compare human rights violations. There are human rights violations around the world. What I found personally very challenging about doing the work with respect to Guantanamo detainees was the US government as the direct perpetrator of the harm. With respect to Egypt, it's enabling it. But as a direct perpetrator, I think it was especially challenging for me as an American. But US policy towards Egypt now, towards the Middle East in general, towards the remaining couple dozen detainees in Guantanamo, in my mind, is still informed by the post 9/11 mentality that has imbued US foreign policy with usually not explicit, but certainly implicit view of the world, which is an anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-non-white American view. And there are many, many people throughout the US government who do not have those personal views. The arc of US foreign policy, however, and to a certain extent domestic policy, in other ways, is really rooted in racism. And I think that if we don't unpack that, it's very difficult to then just get at, why put your money here and there? Why not demand that this dictator do that and this dictator do that? When that is at the root of things, then what you see on the surface isn't always as obvious. So I think we have a much larger project than just sort of the day-to-day work that you and I do at the Freedom Initiative to unpack that. And I think many people are doing that. And I think a younger generation that sees the intersection of different issues, that sees, Free Palestine as a component of the movement for Black lives, I think that movement is going to fundamentally change global relations. And it will take time, but I think as people start to see that oppression of one person is just as important if it occurs in Egypt as if it occurs in Southeast DC, that will change the way that politicians then have to respond to their constituents, which ultimately will inform both domestic and foreign policy. A real problem that I think we have here in the United States is that ordinary Americans are not engaged with respect to foreign policy. I know Representative Malinowski can speak better to this, but except for a few key issues like Ukraine, like briefly Yemen, people's phones are not ringing off the hook with calls about US foreign policy. How much money are you giving to Egypt? Exactly what did you say to the Saudis? That's not something that people from Iowa are calling into Washington about day in and day out. And that means that the people in Washington are free to make their own decisions based on what they think is politically expedient, hopefully what they think is morally right as well. But it's a different structure than you see on many other issues. So until we really build a solid constituency for a human rights centric foreign policy that comes from the people of the United States, I don't think we will see a fundamental shift. We will see, obviously different politicians matter, different people in Congress, different people in the White House. They make a huge difference when it comes to policy, but to a certain extent, they are reflecting the rest of the country. So we need to educate and inform the rest of the country so that a right-centric foreign policy and domestic policy become what people are demanding every day.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We are about 90 seconds from hitting the 1 hour mark, and I want to make sure we don't go over. There are a lot of questions that were asked. I am sorry to the people whose questions we were not able to get to, but I'd like to end starting with Congressman Malinowski, then Hassan, Fadr, and ending with Andrea. In 30 seconds or less, what would you like to leave us in the room with in commemorating, as we gather today, in commemorating the massacre of Rabaa?
I would just like everybody to have a sense that there is power in good advocacy that is connected to smart politics. Members of Congress do listen to constituents. And I can tell you there aren't any people lobbying Congress from within the constituencies of members saying, oh, we should be giving $1.3 billion to Egypt every year. Most people would not be for that if they knew that it was happening. And members of Congress do actually take up causes that are not at the forefront of American politics if a dozen of their constituents come to see them and say, this is really, really important to us. If they hear about the issue at a campaign event, at a fundraiser, it's important for the advocacy to be done in Washington. It's important for politicians in America to hear about this back home, and you don't need a movement of millions of people to accomplish that.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Hassan.
لو في رسالة أحب أقولها فهي إنه لو كنا معنيين بالعدالة.
I think we lost Hassan due to internet problems. If he comes and he's able to join us back, we will get back. We'll go back to him. But Fadl.
I just have one word. Recognize us. Recognize our ongoing suffering. That's all.
Thank you. And Andrea?
Just want to say we have not forgotten.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our esteemed guests and panelists for making the time, taking time out of their busy days to join us in this moment of commemoration and remembrance. And thank you to the people who joined us from all over the world, both here in the Zoom room and over YouTube and on our social media to listen in. Please feel free to follow our work, or please actually actively follow our work at the Freedom Initiative. Follow our social media accounts and reach out to us if there's anything we can do to help loved ones behind bars. Thank you so much, and hope to see you guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.